So let me introduce Linda MacDonald. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Washington in the USA, and she's specialized in treating couples and individuals seeking to recover from infidelity for over 33 years. And Linda's book, I was just chatting to Linda about this amazing ebook she has on Amazon. It's called How to Help Your Spouse Heal from Your Affair, and it has sold over 124,000 copies, has over 2,500 positive reviews on Amazon, which is quite amazing. And Linda has helped establish 3 counselling centres over her career, and she enjoys teaching, running workshops and leading therapy groups and entertaining her 8 grandchildren. You must have your hands full, Linda, when they're all around. And she recently retired from her counselling practice to focus on her book writing and help her injured spouse recover. So welcome, Linda. How are you today?
Good. Clinton, nice to meet both you and Juliet.
Fantastic. Well, let's get underway. I know you want to share some slides, but before we do that, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background. How did you become interested in working in this area?
Well, I started my career as a dental hygienist, and I kept cutting my dental hygiene hours down to do volunteer counseling for a church in our area. And then I ran the lay counseling program and found that I was in over my head and decided I needed professional training. So I went back to graduate school to become a marriage and family therapist. And it seems like from the get-go, I was drawn to helping particularly couples affected by infidelity. And when I look back, the only thing I can think of that may have started me on that road was I grew up in an alcoholic home. And my dad's bottle seemed to be like another lover. It took him away from us. It took his loyalty and devotion and time away from us as a family. And my parents never divorced, but on the other hand, it created a lot of havoc. And I developed a heart for people that have some sort of chemical influence pulling them away from their spouses. And I seem to have a knack for it. I don't know why, but I started reading lots of books and attending seminars and just learning from experience.
And that led you to the infidelity, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so Linda, you want to do you want to just start your slides now and then you can just address the questions?
Sure. Yes. I did you want to start with that first question that you sent me, or what?
I can't see the questions right now, but yeah, the one that said you talk about the importance of instilling hope. Yeah, starting there.
Okay. Yes, on the first session, it's pretty critical to try and instill hope, because the couple are usually pretty discouraged, scared to death. And I normalize the roller coaster of emotions. That's normal. That I try to frame the recovery process as actually giving them a new high watermark in their ability to tolerate big emotions and to resolve conflict. So that's the first point I make. I also like to use the broken bone illustration. And what that amounts to is showing them a picture of how a bone that's been broken, if it's set correctly, the hematoma that first appears where there's a lot of inflammation, if it's stabilized with good support, a soft callus forms. And so the matrix starts to build up, and then it hardens over time. And then finally, the bone is remodeled in the place where the break was. In fact, it's thicker there, and it's actually stronger there than it is anywhere else along the bone. And I try to tell couples, if you hang in there through the process, you get the support you need, and you're patient, that in time, your relationship will get strengthened where it was once broken. And it, in fact, will be stronger there than in any other part of your relationship. I love to also talk, well, I guess I'll let you ask me the question about neuroscience.
Yeah, so Linda,
Just go ahead, just continue on, Linda.
Yeah,
okay.
you can just go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, if they understand the neuroscience of affairs, it helps both partners. For the betraying spouse, the one who's been unfaithful, they need to learn that the infatuation they experience with an affair is different than the infatuation that got them married. And that's because when there's secrecy and forbiddenness involved, it magnifies those neurotransmitters like dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, vasopressin, phenylethylamine, and endorphins. It blows them up beyond what would be possible in a normal public relationship. And so they don't realize they're in a state of what Deborah Tanoff calls limerence. Pat Love describes how the secrecy and forbiddenness is what magnifies and heightens the effect of these neuroamines on the brain. And it actually mimics the effect of morphine. So people who are in an affair actually are experiencing a type of drug infusion in their brains. What this leads to is emotional distortion. They think they're in reality, but actually they've developed an affair bubble that is outside, doesn't have the reality and baggage free that a normal relationship would. And there's a phenomenon called the positive mirroring of the self, which is what Dr. Shirley Glass talks about. And that's where you see yourself as perfect in the other person's eyes, because everybody's dressed perfectly for work. There's no crying babies. There's no financial problems. And so they have this unrealistic reflection coming back to them like they are perfect. And of course, their spouse doesn't see them that way because their spouse knows them. And so the euphoria itself creates an insensitivity toward the partner, and it may cause them to regress to a state of adolescence. They feel invulnerable, reckless, and may actually have attitudes of entitlement, kind of like a teenager. And I know a lot of people see people in midlife crisis, and that's why they seem so energized, is their ego has been boosted and they're not living in total reality. If the therapist understands this, they are less likely to buy into the distorted views that come along with it. What happens within the betrayed person is the betrayed person is having a different experience. They're usually in denial. They don't really, how would I say, face what's going on. They may not know what's going on. The betrayer is usually gaslighting them or lying to them, and so they doubt their own perceptions. But they may notice an increase in impatience, unexplained absences, emotional distances, and excuses that don't add up. They may have even a gut feeling, but they don't have hard evidence. So because of that, they doubt their own perceptions. However, once they discover what's been going on, they are deeply shocked. And Dr. Glass compares it to thinking you're married to a 5-star general only to learn he's a Russian spy. That's how shocking it is. And it causes a severe attachment wound, which breaches their bond of safety. You know, in nature, we are conditioned to need a safe primary attachment person. When we're babies, we attach to our mothers or a mother figure. As adults, we attach to our partner. When there is an affair, there's a threat of losing that partner, and it feels life-threatening, which, in terms of the biochemistry, causes excess cortisol and adrenaline to surge through them, and that triggers the fight, flight, or freeze response that we know about. Here's an example. Trauma, when cortisol floods the system, it might lead to fight mode. Anybody known a betrayed spouse that got really angry upon discovery? Or flight mode, they may be scared to death and want to run away. Another mode is freeze mode, where they're just absolutely terrified, and so they shrink and tremble and have other symptoms of PTSD. Or they may, and what happens then is the therapist might misjudge the partner and forget about the cortisol and think, oh, they're just hysterical or they're overreacting, when actually it's trauma. That's what's going on. Freud used to mislabel some people in trauma as being hysterical. We all probably remember that from school. But actually, the person has gone into survival mode because it feels like their life is on the line. So how it affects a person in an affair when it impacts the marriage, the person in trauma experiences an increased intensity depending on how impersonal or personal the breach is. When it's caused by an act of nature, for example, tornadoes, that sort of thing, that has one level of trauma. And if it's sudden and brief versus prolonged. But the further you go down this line, the more intense the trauma is and the higher the chance of developing actual post-traumatic stress. So if it's a car accident, it's unintentional by a human, but it still is painful. Intentional human, but a stranger, that's one kind, like an assault or a rape by a stranger, that has one set of meaning. But if it's intentional and human with an intimate person that we trust, that makes the trauma even more magnified. That's why sex abuse is so damaging, and spousal infidelity. Some people experience repeat infidelity by their spouse, and it's prolonged, and that can lead to some of the worst kind of post-traumatic stress. So as therapists, it helps to help the unfaithful person recognize that their emotional distortion is affecting them. And it has led to, I'm going to go back to this slide, cognitive dissonance. What happens is their emotions are telling them one thing, and it's pulling them in one direction, but their prior values, maybe their appreciation for their spouse and their beliefs would say another, but they can only straddle that for so long. What Leon Festinger found is people tend to lean in the direction of their emotions. And in order to live with themselves, and if they come down on the side of their emotions and go against their prior principles, they have to choose to rationalize and make it okay. He used the example of smoking and people coming up with excuses why smoking is okay. The same thing with affairs. People have to come up with rationalizations to make what they're doing okay and make their feelings align with their beliefs. As therapists, we need to know that's going on, because that rationalization can be a trap for us, and they can manipulate a therapist into telling them just what they want to hear. So we have to rise and be meta to the situation to recognize what's going on. When they go from emotional distortion to cognitive dissonance, and then they end up rationalizing, this leads to a phenomenon called rewriting the marital history. And this overrides what Gottman calls their prior positive sentiment override. The bad times are what they remember, and the good times disappear. They lose their attachment with their spouse if they've over-attached to the affair partner. And so they're telling other people or telling themselves or telling a therapist a bit of a stilted version of their marital history. And if we as therapists aren't aware of that, we can get fooled into thinking, wow, their spouse is quite a witch or a warlock or very boring. The other thing that can happen as therapists is if we're romantics at heart, like I am, we can get fooled into sympathizing with the person involved in the affair and thinking, oh, that's so wonderful. How do I object to this? I don't blame them. And so we can get trapped by that. It's like when we go to the movies and you see The English Patient or The Bridges of Madison County. It plays on our emotions because we all love romance, even if it's illicit, I hate to say. In terms of the common mistakes that therapists make, number one, the betrayer's story needs to not be taken at face value. We need to be aware of what version they may be giving us. Mistake number two is jumping to conclusions too quickly. I had a man come in to see me, and he'd been to a therapist in the area. She was a psychologist, very well-known person. And the first thing she said at the end of their first session was, well, the best you can hope for is an amicable divorce. That wasn't what he wanted to hear. So he came into me and we worked together and he cut things off with the affair partner, really did a lot of hard repair work, brought his wife in, and they ended up working it out. And so we have to be careful not to make premature conclusions. Number 3 mistake is to not recognize the trauma going on within the injured spouse. I had a gal come to me and her husband was in some sort of compulsive sexual behaviors. He was involved with pornography. And I'm not trained in pornography treatment or sex addiction. I usually refer those folks to a CSAT trained specialist. So I sent her husband to someone that was kind of new in the area, but I knew had some sex addiction training. Turns out he misjudged some things. I think it was his youngness in the field. She brought in page after page after page of all the porn sites he'd been to, and he was treating her horrible. He was criticizing her body, and she was very fit for her age. She looked wonderful. Anyway, and that's a perception thing anyway. And he wanted to do kinky stuff that he saw online that she was uncomfortable with. Well, I got permission all the way around, and I gave the therapist these pages. He completely minimized the pornography, not knowing that it was harming the marriage, and he judged my client as being over controlling. And that was because he didn't understand the trauma. Now, she had a history of some trauma, so that may have magnified things. Nevertheless, he wasn't recognizing that trauma causes a person to act in uncharacteristic ways because they think their very survival is at stake.
Linda,
Yes.
your slides are advancing.
I know, because I have some more slides in a minute.
Oh, okay, okay.
I apologize.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I could probably go back to this until I make it to the next slide. Mistake number 3 is, or number 4, excuse me, is ignoring the elephant in the room. And that is assuming that if we just work on the communication issues, the affair will go away. And I would say that's the number one thing that I end up having to kind of clean up when people come to me after seeing someone else. And that just comes from inexperience. Maybe they're afraid to address the affair. Maybe they have this magical belief that the affair is just a symptom of a troubled marriage. If we help the marriage reconnect, that the affair will go away, and that never happens. So that's where we get into the differences between the kinds of therapy. When, as a systems trained therapist, we were taught, don't get into linear thinking. That's where you focus on the content of what's going on. And it ends up in a blame cycle. A plus B equals C. And so someone is causing the conflict. In systems training, we're taught to look for patterns, the process, and the dynamics. And we try to think in circular terms. A behavior invites B behavior, which invites behavior C, which also invites behavior A, and it's a circle. And we know that if you intervene anywhere along the circle, it can change the dynamic of the destructiveness that might be going on in the relationship. What is the weakness of the systems model is that when you have someone that's addicted to something like alcohol, we all, I think, are trained to know that you need to treat the addiction first before you can do couples work. Even though it's affecting the couple, you need to deal with the substance. Well, the same thing is true when it comes to infidelity. There's an outside influence going on. If you see here, the betrayed spouse and the unfaithful spouse have a connection, but this person does not know about the affair partner. And so there's this unseen force tugging at the partner, and it's affecting them as a couple, but nevertheless, it develops a life of its own. And so just intervening here with the connection between the couple doesn't take care of the affair dynamic and the chemistry and all the distortion that goes with it. So that's why the addiction model is useful, because if you think of the affair as like an addiction, it's having an outside influence on the couple, then you can begin to treat the whole situation more effectively. I think of this is kind of a rudimentary example, but the moon is outside of Earth's atmosphere, just like a couple has their own atmosphere. And the affair partner and that relationship is kind of like the moon. It tugs at the Earth and its atmosphere, changes the weather, affects the tides. This is from a vacation we went to, Yachats, Oregon, where it was high tide. And it has a huge effect, even if it's unseen, even if it's behind the clouds. And so in our work with couples, we need to realize the affair develops a life of its own. I sort of look at it a little bit like this, in that the betrayed and the unfaithful spouse have their own system here, but the affair partner is tugging at them and they've developed their own system here. You have to get rid of this in order to help this. I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. Fantastic. I love seeing the visuals. I think it just makes such a difference there. We've got a few more questions, haven't we here, Juliet, or were they all answered by the slides?
Yeah, which ones would I guess number 6, Linda, is that where we start? The safety model versus the addiction model?
Yeah, that's what I just described.
Yeah, oh, that's one of the, okay, so we can start with the next one. Clinton, you want to go ahead with that one?
Yes, this question's about what are the strategies you recommend for therapists to avoid being misled by a partner who has been unfaithful and their potential rationalizations?
Well, I always tie back into being aware of the phenomenon of emotional distortion, the cognitive dissonance, the rationalization, and the rewriting of the history. That helps if we can keep that in mind when we're talking to someone, so we don't inadvertently reinforce their rationalizations. I had one person who went to see a therapist and was all worried, where was God when I was in love with this affair partner? And the therapist said, well, God was still loving you. And he said, how? And the therapist said, through, and he names the other woman. Now, that was not helpful, because he was buying into the client's rationalizations behind the affair. Does that kind of make sense? So we can get tugged and pulled in. And I guess I think of myself as a hopeless romantic, and like I get influenced by movies and I just find myself rooting for the wrong people. And you just have to check your own biases, your own emotions at the door and go, how do I stay meta? How do I keep the marriage as my primary client as I'm able? And then not make quick judgments. In terms of the components about restoring trust, can I jump into that? In general, I try to reduce the betrayer's fear, their defensiveness. They're scared to be honest. They're uncomfortable. They want the spouse to just get over it so that the suffering disappears between them. So I try to help them not blame their spouse or try and shut down the conversation or demand instant forgiveness, or you should be over this by now. But I try to encourage them to aim for relational integrity. And yet I also try to help the spouse who's been wounded not to become abusive. So here's the basic steps that I like to go over with the betrayer. Number 1 is breaking off 100% with the affair partner. That means new job, or it can mean a new building. It means building whatever walls you can between yourself and the person you had the affair with. No more contact at all. No texting, no emails, nothing. Now, this can be tricky when there's a family member involved, and that means certain family events may not get attended, or it's really tricky. I don't know what to say. Those are on an individual basis. I try and teach them it's better to volunteer information rather than have it dragged out of you, because that doesn't help the trust. If you volunteer it, then the person goes, okay, you're at least, volunteering this, you're being honest. I don't have to wait around wondering, when am I going to find out about this? So they have to have a policy of no more secrets. And as part of volunteering it, they need to answer their spouse's questions and not evade and try and avoid answering their questions. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use sensitivity. You don't tell them every single thought that went through your head when you were having sex with the other person. But you do say where it happened, how often. You give them the basic answers of what they're asking without showing a lot of reluctance. Otherwise, it gives the spouse the feeling you're holding more secrets. I teach them to anticipate triggers, expect them. And to respond with kindness instead of taking it as an insult. For example, I'll have them revisit a site of where a tryst happened, like a parking lot that they met in or a hotel. And they'll sit together in the car, and then the injured spouse will just sob and share all their hurt and their feelings associated with that particular event, and then have the unfaithful person hold them, show sympathy, grieve with them, give them room to express their pain without any defensiveness, and comfort them. That can be very effective. Anticipate triggers on TV. Infidelity comes up all the time on television shows, right? So a good, aware betrayer reaches out their hand and holds the hand of the betrayed and says, how you doing? Is this okay? Do you need me to change the channel? They anticipate triggers instead of waiting until they blow up and happen. They volunteer their email passwords, social media. They will block all tempting media sites. They will avoid all secret behaviors that they used to engage in, like taking the cell phone into the bathroom. They don't have unexplained absences. The sense is that the spouse always knows where their partner is. And if they are away on business, they stay in frequent contact. Number 5 is frequent check-ins. I wished I'd emphasize this more in my book, because that is a huge calming thing for the betrayed spouse, is to be proactive. And what I'll do, for example, is in session, I'll ask the betrayed spouse, how often are you thinking about the affair? And they'll usually say something like, every 2 minutes, 24 hours a day, most of the night. And the betraying spouse is usually shocked, because they're so relieved that they're no longer lying that it isn't on their mind nearly as much. And so it's important for them to have that information, that that's how often it's on the mind of the betrayed. So if they frequently check in, how you doing? How was today? I had one guy that was on the verge of retiring. And so rather than leave his job and lose his whole retirement, she agreed to let him continue on the condition that he would give her every detail of what happened during the day. So he put a timer on his watch. And when he got home at 5 o'clock, he went through every encounter, everything that was said, everything that happened during the day. So she had a full accounting of his time. The next thing is learning to do a meaningful apology. I have a whole list in the website link that I gave you on wording that you can help people with. Now, it has to come from the heart. You can't just do rote apologies, but nevertheless, some people need a little coaching and help on how to make an apology meaningful. And also sometimes when it comes to making amends, it might mean if the betrayer invited the affair partner into the home, they paint every wall that the affair partner walked into. That I've had people do that. I've had them change the bedding. I've even had them change the bed, get rid of the bed frame. They get rid of the whole shebang because they don't want that trigger in their home. And that effort carries weight with the betrayed spouse. And then I encourage people to have a small team around them. Number 7. There's a book called Restoring the Fallen by Earl and Sandy Wilson, where they do small group and therapy people around them so that they're not just flailing in between counseling sessions. CSATs are great at applying group work. I try anytime I have somebody that's able to be involved in a group, it really adds to the effectiveness of my work. In terms of the betrayed spouse and the rebuilding of trust, I help them learn to retrust their intuitions, because usually during the affair, their intuitions have been completely denied or disallowed. And we go back and we try to distinguish between what's a panic reaction or hypervigilance and what was their true intuition, their enteric system. It's called the second brain. What was that telling them? And so I help them distinguish between that and panic. And that seems to calm them down and help with the rebuilding of trust. I also try to help the betrayed person not to blame the spouse, and the spouse not to blame themselves for the affair, because they may have contributed to the vulnerability, but they may not have. It may have been all stuff within the betrayer. And so they may have set the stage, but they didn't make the person go have an affair. Dr. Pittman says it's very difficult to force someone to have an affair if they don't want to. And that seems to relieve some of the guilt that might be on either person's side.
That's a great list, Linda. Really some great ideas there for restoring trust after infidelity. You've already shared a couple of practical interventions you've used. That was an interesting one about asking the couple to go together to revisit a scene where infidelity occurred. Are there any other practical interventions you've used that you've found have been very powerful for repairing a relationship that's ruptured in this way?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, if I notice that there's invalidation going on, usually from the betrayer being scared to validate the feelings of the betrayed spouse, if they're invalidating the other person's pain, minimizing it or whatever, I'll just casually get up in a session and I'll go stand on their toe. Now, I'm not doing this abusively, but it's obviously uncomfortable. And I'll just keep talking to them like nothing's going on. And the person will kind of start objecting, going, can you get off my foot? And I'll say, what are you talking about? This is uncomfortable. It's not bothering me. And they get the message, like, oh, this is what I'm doing to my partner. So that's one practical one. Educating them about the neurobiology of affairs. It helps both people take it less personally. If they know that on the betrayed person's part, their spouse's actions weren't as personal as it felt. And for the betrayer, it helps them know my feelings fooled me. And they might feel really foolish. I've had people just weep when they realize that their emotions fooled them into the state that they were in. And that when they pull out of emotional distortion, it's a relief and it's a huge revelation to them. We all do the speaker listener technique. I assume most of us. I'll use a coaster for a cup, and the person that's holding the coaster is the speaker, and they get to talk as long as they need to, and then have the listener reflect back what they hear. And if they feel understood, then they will trade the coaster. So it helps just to have an object. I frame the roller coaster as normal. It's scary, but they're not going to die. I try to create space for the biggest intense agreements in the therapy. In other words, if they feel like they get stuck at home, one person used to call it going into the dungeon where we can't get out. And I'd say save that for in therapy. So I try to create space in the therapy room for them to have a safe place to process the toughest stuff. I look for ways to empower both people. A lot of times the strayer is just as avoidant of conflict as the betrayed. And so they each have their reasons for how they interact around the affair. So I try to empower them rather than be passive aggressive on either part. Emily Brown, Dr. Emily Brown, I have her book in my suggested books for professionals. She's outstanding when it comes to understanding how avoidance of intimacy and conflict factor into the dynamics of an affair. I'll have them write a list of the positive traits about their spouse and put it in their phone so they can frequently remind themselves, this is why I married this person. These are the good qualities about them. And so that they rebalance what was lost in what they used to have as the positive sentiment override. Sometimes I'll have them put a sticky note on their head. I don't know if this is backwards to you, but it says, I am not the enemy. And I'll have them sit through a whole session with that sticky note on their foreheads. Sometimes I've used only a few times. CSATs do this a lot in terms of using a polygraph. I've only done it a couple of times, but both times they were helpful, either in getting the person to finally come forth with more truth the night before they're going to have the polygraph, or it validates the fact they've been being told the truth for the one who's suspicious of their betrayer. The final thing I try to integrate is their faith. If they're a person of faith, I try to be very respectful, whatever their faith is, and allow them to bring that into the room instead of acting like it has no place, because that's where they get comfort a lot of times. That's where they feel grounded. And so I try to honor that. When it comes to churches, there's strengths and weaknesses. The strengths of engaging in a faith community are having access to small group support. Some churches are great about that. There's Celebrate Recovery. I don't know if you've heard of that. Pure Desire, Prodigals International. The downside is that they focus so much on sex addiction that the person that's had a, if you want to call it garden variety affair, may feel a little bit overlooked or like they can't 100% relate. The other downside is that pastors are not trained counselors, and they make sometimes uninformed comments that are victim blaming, such as, and I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, he wouldn't be looking elsewhere if he was getting enough at home. That is a myth. I can't tell you how often sex addicts get plenty of sex at home and they're still wondering, or even a person involved in serial affairs. So that's a myth, and I find that that's a downside. Also, pastors and friends may encourage the injured person to forgive too quickly, like that's going to be a band-aid, but that can be just another form of denial. And so I try to help them have permission to take a long time to work through the forgiveness process and to do it each incident at a time. Premature forgiveness robs both people of a process that they need if they're going to have good, effective reconciliation.
That's great, Linda. Thank you. So final question, and then we've got a bunch of questions that have come in here. We'll have to try to answer some of them at least. I don't know if we'll get through them all. But the last question is, can you just share one example or a story, a success story that you had? Because it's always good to hear those.
Sure. I actually can't take full credit when I have a success story. I'm just going to be honest with you. I never know who's going to make it long term and who isn't. Okay. Who has the capacity to heal as a couple? One couple I thought we were making really good headway with. He was a banker and she was a stay-at-home mom. And we worked through a lot of the stuff we've talked about. But he came in loaded for bear when he read my book and he said, but I don't think I need to leave my job. I have detached from the other woman. She's not important to me. I want to save my marriage. But his wife was a wreck. Every day he went to work and she'd become pregnant in the meantime. She felt like he's comparing my body with her. The sparks might fly again. How do I know if they're not doing lunches? Blah, blah, blah. So this went on for a year. And he finally decided, in the meantime, she had a hard time expressing feelings. And so when she was angry, it would just build up in her and she'd kick him. Now, it wasn't abusive kicking, but it was enough that he knew she was unhappy. Well, guess what? He finally got the message that she couldn't tolerate being terrified every day he went to work. He found another job, half hour further away. And guess what? The kicking stopped. And they worked out their marriage successfully after that. I've run into them other times, and they're doing quite well.
Fantastic. Good. Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Now, before we jump to questions, we do want to share your resources. You've got some wonderful resources available. Of course, your website is lindajmcdonald.com, and we put a link there in the chat where you have some free articles that are geared for professionals. So check out those. And of course, your incredible book, I'm sure that's helpful for clinicians as well as the general public, How to Help Your Spouse Heal from Your Affair. So we put the link to that on Amazon, but I'm sure that can be bought at other places as well online and through your website. Is that right?
I just connect them to Amazon.
Amazon. Okay. One-stop shop. Okay. Fantastic. And I know some people have to leave the webinar early. We do want to quickly let you know about our free training at the moment. There's been a phenomenal response. We've had over 4,000 people sign up for the free training and people going nuts about internal family systems. So if you haven't signed up already, there's the link. It will be available just for, I think April 2 might be the last day you can sign up for the free training. So check that out.
Actually, Clinton, there was over 6,000 this morning, so it's
there
probably,
you go.
yeah.
It's going nuts. Yeah. Now let's go to the first question. This is an interesting one, Linda. How do you work with double affairs where one partner has had an affair and then the other partner has a revenge affair? And how do you navigate working with a partner who believes that their revenge affair was justified and that what their partner did was worse? That's a tricky situation.
It is very tricky, and I end up having to, how would I say, they need to do all the same work as they would as if only one of them had an affair. So the first person who had the affair has to do all the work of apologizing, making amends, paying attention to triggers. But I don't let the other person get away with the revenge affair and acting like that, because usually revenge affairs are all about not just needing the validation as a woman or man, but it's also, I need him or her to get the pain that they put me through. And I don't justify that. They're going to have to do the same repair work. And I try to make it clear that it's not fair to compare affairs. Affairs are affairs, and they're painful, they're breaches, they break the attachment, and they're both going to have to do the same work.
That's a good answer. What modality helps clients best heal from that chronic and intense limerence? What is that? Did you say that?
Limerence?
Limerence. I don't know that word, I don't think.
Oh, yeah, Deborah Tanoff writes about that. In terms of that's for the unfaithful person, right?
Is that what it said? Let me just go back here. Oh, I lost it. I don't know where it is, Clinton. It's gone. Oh, it's here. No, that's not there. Oh, helps clients best heal from the chronic. Yes.
Oh,
yeah. So it's not the one that's had the affair.
oh, okay. Trauma-informed therapy. And I was not trained in EMDR, but I have a high respect for it. There's also attachment-focused EMDR. I've had some of my colleagues that favor that. I was trained in lifespan integration by Peggy Pace, and they have a trauma protocol that's worked really well. I have found that you can't heal trauma by traditional therapy. There has to be a connecting where the imprint of the trauma is on the right side of the brain, and that needs to be connected with the left, and all these connections need to happen. So visual, somatic, polyvagal, all those different therapies. I've got a list in the material that is on the link of the different kinds of therapies that I'm familiar with, but I know there's even more than I know about, but it needs to include the right side of the brain and be trauma informed to help the betrayed.
Can't hear you, Clinton. Clinton, can't hear you.
This is a common question, Linda. You were very clear that the affair has to finish. But this person's asking, is there any point to start couples therapy when the affair has not ended?
I mix it up because a lot of times they need it just depends how much secrecy is being still held. I can't do effective repair work between them, but I can support each one as they're wherever they're at. So sometimes just having a space where the amount that's known comes in. I try not to hold secrets, though, to be honest. I know some people feel comfortable with that. I don't. I tend to tell the strayer if they want to bring in the spouse, they need to be upfront with me and that I need to get permission all the way around. So I'm not asked to hold secrets, but generally I don't expose the secrets. I'll push you to so that it comes from the strayer until it's all worked out. And then sometimes it really works out well in that when they need to start setting boundaries with the affair partner, because a lot of times they end up being that fatal attraction person and they have to really work at getting boundaries. I'll have them be a part of that boundary, like listening in on the conversation when the affair partner is called to close it off, or me even being in the restaurant, in another part of the restaurant, when the unfaithful one is breaking it off with the affair partner so they can kind of be a witness. So sometimes that helps to have them be a part of it. That's just a little piece.
Great. Somebody's asking, do you ever address why the infidelity happened?
Well, that's a combination of symptom model. The thing with the symptom model is, yes, it's a symptom of maybe some distress in the marriage. A lot of times the person who is unfaithful has no clue why they were vulnerable. I go a lot into family of origin because I believe family of origin modeling attitudes. Bonnie Iker-Weil wrote a book that basically says 80% of her clients have either a parent who had an affair or a grandparent who had an affair, even if they don't know it. It seems to run in families. I did a genogram on the Kennedy family. It's amazing how that proliferated. And so it's important to find out as much as you can about why. But for the betrayed person, I just tell them, you're trying to make sense of something that's a bit insane. It's okay that it doesn't make sense because it really doesn't. It's not as personal as it feels. And but I do like to tie in family of origin and why it is. Emily Brown's wonderful. She has a whole series of questions that she has people answer at their first appointment. Why us? Why now? What is it that set the stage without blaming the betrayed spouse? Because there's a lot of things that happen that can set the stage.
That's great. Linda, this is an interesting scenario. Someone's asking about when an affair is disclosed, but it was in the past, say a year ago, and it has ended. It's been ended for a significant amount of time. What have you noticed about how that impacts the relationship as opposed to an affair that maybe is very recently ended or is still ongoing?
It's all over the map. I have, it mostly depends on the humility of the unfaithful person. I know Dr. Laura likes to encourage people, if you're the one that needs to suffer for what you did a long time ago. If you're tormented, so what? Why make your spouse suffer? I'm not of that mind. I'm more along with Shirley Glass that secrets affect a marriage. We are as sick as our secrets, as Bradshaw says. So, but it's the humility on the part of the confessor, the one who brings it up. And some people can't handle it. They would have left anyway if they'd found out when it happened or if they find out later. Depends on how disgusting it is. I find that people have less tolerance for prostitutes in the mix than they might a single affair. It's all over the place. The humility on the part of the unfaithful helps a lot, but I can never predict what's going to work out. There is a study that says that when it's left secret, 80% of those people end up divorced. But when it's been confessed, 40% end up divorced. So even though it does contribute to divorce, there's a higher chance there will be divorce when a secret is being kept.
Right.
Oh, here's an interesting question. Does forgiveness require reconciliation? I agree that hasty forgiveness is not recommended. However, forgiveness may not be for the other one, but for the person, him or herself. When you forgive, you do not change the past, but the future.
Yeah, I want to write a whole book on that subject. Reconciliation requires rebuilding of trust.
Mhm.
And so there needs to be a process on both people's parts. I think of it as moving toward each other when they share the pain, the grief, the feelings, they process it. Whereas if the person isn't sorry or they don't change their behavior, then you're left with the unilateral type of forgiveness where you need to find a way to let go, even though the person never changed. You don't have to trust them again. It's a parallel process. You're not closer together, but it will taint your heart and your other relationships if you remain in a state of anger. So it's both processes are a bit different. There's a couple books that I really like. Janice Abrams Spring wrote one, How Can I Forgive You? And she frames it as letting go rather than the word forgiveness, because too many people associate forgiveness with absolution, like they're absolved of all responsibility, and that isn't true. And the other book I love is Forgiving the Unforgivable by Beverly Flanagan. There's a lot of books by that title, but Beverly Flanagan was part of the Stanford Research Project on forgiveness. And she's my favorite author, and it's not religious at all. It gives you practical steps on how to let go of even egregious pain. So that's in my book list that I recommend.
Right. Here's an interesting one, Linda. Are all affair dynamics co-created, or are there cases when the betrayed partner is not co-responsible?
A high percent of the time they're not. I'm just going to be honest with you, because all marriages have distress. All marriages have their conflicts. People just choose to cope with them differently. Sometimes someone who gets involved in an affair, it's just an affair of opportunity, but it means something wasn't going on well inside in terms of their personal boundaries and so on. So I when the how do I say this quickly? When the pornography and the sex addiction thing became more well known, they formed Sex Addicts Anonymous and these groups, and then they formed COSA groups, which is co-addict, just like the Alcoholic Families model. The problem with that is half the time the betrayed person doesn't even know what's going on. The betrayer is involved in what Dr. Omar Minwala calls the secret sexual basement. So they're not really a part of the system that has created the affair. So yes, it can be a symptom of problems in the relationship, but more than that, the issues within the betrayer are probably the deeper ones that need addressing. They had a lot of other options besides an affair.
Yeah, it's like all about the choice, isn't it? Because I mean, you could have the exact same relationship with the exact same problems. One person chooses to do this and another person chooses to have an affair, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
Does the length of the affair have impact on the repair?
It does in terms of it can. I worked with one couple. She was in an affair from the time they were engaged for the next 10 years. And somehow they worked it out. And so I've seen it go both ways. Somebody can have a one-night stand and boom, their spouse is done. I've seen other people with a long time affair. I would say it depends on how much it disrupted the attachment. And if it's a threat to the other person. So I can't, length matters, but it's
Not always.
Not always. Yeah.
Well, we probably have time for only one more question, Linda, and this is always an interesting one. What are your thoughts on polyamorous and consensual non-monogamy relationships? Of course, these relationship structures, people can also experience a betrayal. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not a fan of polyamory nor the consent model, only because the people I've dealt with that ended up in polyamory were really manipulated into it, or they were trying to please and appease another spouse that had wandering tendencies. I haven't seen any longitudinal studies on the health of polyamory, to be really honest with you. I'm just going to be upfront. Too many people end up getting emotionally attached to somebody. There's disloyalty. It's confusing for the kids. It just leads to a lot of problems. And the word consent is misleading. Just because you consent to something initially doesn't mean your whole heart's in it or that it ends up being okay. So I think it can be too much of an excuse to say, well, I had my spouse's consent, so I can go away for a weekend and have flings, or I can move somebody into our home, or however they want to structure it. All the language around polyamory is just a fancy way to do wife swapping. I'm sorry, that's just my personal opinion.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed this webinar today. The presentation was great. We had an amazing turnout and so many interesting questions. And I really appreciate you giving up your time, Linda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. It was great.
Thanks.
Now, just before we
Thanks,
leave
everyone.
here, we just want to let you know about our next webinar. I'll just put the link, the information there. This is called Therapy with South Asian Clients, and this is with Pooja Mamidana. And we'll be meeting with her on the 24th of April, North American time at 3 p.m. Pacific. And just keep an eye on your inbox. We'll send you all the details about that webinar as it comes up, and we look forward to seeing you then. So thanks, Linda. Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.